Okay. I always move in the wrong direction.
Welcome back to Absolutely Understand Guitar. I'm Scotty West. Well, today we're in the thick of it. We're going to be talking about the huge subject of intervals, and we'll be discussing them for the next 2 hours. This is lesson 12, so make sure your book is open to page 12. Keep reviewing your past material. Remember, if you want to satisfy yourself, you've got to know what you're doing inside out. Ready? Here we go. Hi, welcome back. Boy, we're going to be talking about a big subject today. In fact, this may be the largest subject in all of music theory, the subject of intervals. But quickly, let's review the past stuff we were talking about last time. Remember, you are in part 2 of my program at this point right now. You learned all the basic stuff about how the language of music works in part 1, all the stuff about how the guitar works and the number system and all that stuff. But you're in part 2 where we're actually trying to knock off these 50 pitch patterns that we keep talking about. And we're doing it in order of complexity in 6 different increments. And this is what I call the 6 levels of pitch theory. Now, we got through the first 2 last week because they're pretty simple. In fact, remember, the first level of complexity in music is so simple that there isn't anything there yet at all, and that's the whole subject of silence. Remember, where would music be without silence? Then, after that, we graduated to the next level, level number 2 of my 6 levels of pitch theory, which is the single note. We reminded ourselves of what musical pitch is about. We also learned the huge concept that in any kind of conventional music, there's a lot of different notes in the song, but there is always one note that's acting as the nucleus note. And we know that concept by a bunch of different terms that we use in different contexts and different styles. Remember, a piece of music is very much like a solar system. You've got the note in the center of the song, like
The
say
note.
that's C, so that means that you're playing
It's the note.
the key of C. So the
C.
word key is a word that we really want to learn to associate. When somebody says, what key are we in? And you say, well, we're in the key of A, then you've alerted them that A is functioning as that nucleus note. Now, some of the other words we learned to associate that were the root. We already knew about that. All chords and scales have roots, so therefore do and note number 1. These are all different ways of describing that root note. The tonic is perhaps a new one to you, but that is one of the more official academic textbook type terms for that nucleus note. And also words like the fundamental and resolution are also important concepts that you're going to want to associate with that. Now, after that, after there was silence, after there was one note, the next most complex patterns that we're going to talk about are patterns that involve 2 notes and the relationship between them, and that is the subject that we're on today, the huge concept of intervals. It might be the most important word in all of music theory. In the end, everything is made up of intervals. A funny thing about music is, now we don't really need a too terribly tight shot on this, but remember our musical slide rule right here. The funny thing about music is it isn't so much what notes you're going to play, because that's going to change depending on what key you're actually playing in. But if we remove this centerpiece from the slide rule altogether and look at this just for itself right here, we see that really what constitutes these patterns is more the spacing of the notes between them. Look at that big space between those 2 notes right there. And here's a couple that are pretty close together over here. This is what intervals are. It's not the notes you play, it's the distances between them. And what a huge subject this is in music. We've got a lot to talk about. We're going to be on this for the next couple of hours. Now, put this up here. Oh, no, before we do that, remember, another thing that we just introduced last time was the notion that now that we're into these more complex patterns, there are actually 6 things that you have to do in order to claim that you've mastered each one of these levels. Let's find out what those things are. First of all, you need to, whoops, wrong pen. First of all, you need to be able to name it. You should know the official musical terms for these different concepts. Second thing you need to be able to do is you need to be able to define it. You have to know what these different things mean. We'll be working our way through all of these things. The third thing that you have to do is you have to give what I call examples and formulas for these different pitch patterns. Fourth, you have to be able to read it. You should know something about these different patterns when you see them as represented as little graphic symbols on a piece of paper. Fifth, you have to be able to play it, which means you know the finger patterns for these different things on your instrument. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, number 6, you have to be able to hear it. You have to know what these different pitch patterns sound like. This, of course, is the huge subject of ear training. Now, in a way, these 6 things that you have to do might sound kind of familiar because this harkens back to what we learned a long time ago about how each pitch pattern you have to learn it 4 different ways. Remember that? You got to be able to think it, you got to be able to read it, you got to be able to speak it, and you've got to recognize it when you hear it. All we've done here is we've kind of broken down the music theory conceptual thing into 3 subheadings. I suppose it's fair to say that if you can name it, define it, and give examples and formulas, that means you know it as a concept. Then if you read it, you know it as notation. If you can play it, then you know how to make your instrument speak for you. And finally, you need to be able to hear it. And we're going to be taking sort of a look at all 6 of these different things on the subject of intervals as we go through this next hour. So, how about number 1? Well, we've named it, right? It's called intervals. Now, we need to define it. Remember, intervals are the pitch distance between any 2 notes. And as we've said, in many ways, this is what constitutes the actual structure of these various patterns. So an interval is the pitch distance between any 2 notes. So, we've named it and we've defined it. Now it's time to move on to examples and formulas. Pull this other sheet up here. This, I want to remind you, is where we start to get into some rather technical stuff about music. And a lot of you I know are going to be going, do I really need to know this stuff? And the answer is you absolutely do. You can either believe me now or you can believe me later. If you want to satisfy yourself, you need to know this stuff. Remember, this is a stripped-down popular music program. This is not about fancy stuff, about fancy music. This is the basic stuff about understanding how your instrument works. You may not completely see where all this stuff is going for right now, but you need to trust me. You need to do a little bit of schoolwork type stuff and actually try to memorize this. There's not an awful lot to it, but this is the part. It's a little bit like school, and you got to apply a little bit of discipline to it. The rewards will be there for you later if you do that. Okay. So, we've named it. It's called intervals. We've defined it. It's the pitch distance between any 2 notes. Now we have to give what I call examples and formulas. Now, the pitch distance between any 2 notes must be an awful lot of different intervals, right? Well, in fact, there are. But we're not going to be looking at all of them at this point. In this column over here, in fact, we're also going to be looking at some distinctions between different types of intervals. And perhaps the first distinction we should make is there are 2 overall types of intervals. There are intervals that are called simple intervals. And then there are other intervals that are called compound intervals. Now, simple intervals are smaller intervals. Some of those intervals that I just played on the piano were rather large, weren't they? Simple intervals are the smaller ones. Simple intervals are all the intervals that would fit inside of 1 octave. So, simple intervals are 1 octave and smaller. Whereas compound intervals, which are the larger bits of distance, here's an octave right here. You know, I'm just going from 1 C here up to the next C. That's an octave of an interval. The larger intervals that are larger than an octave are called compound intervals. They are larger than an octave.
Okay, let's write that down.
Interestingly enough,
Write that down. Write that down. Okay. We gotta write that down. We gotta write that down. Let's see.
You're going to find out these are thought of as expanded simple intervals. Now, what do I mean by that? Take a look up here at the keyboard. Here's C, and here's E. And might want to just pan just a little bit on that. Yep. Now, these two notes, as you can see, are three white keys apart on the piano. I know you're here to take guitar lessons, but remember, a lot of this stuff, theory stuff, is easier to see on the keyboards, and we'll be translating this to the guitar in a moment. Here's C and E. These are an interval of a third apart. Now that you can see that they're actually involve three white keys. That's not necessarily the actual definition of a third, but let's go with that for now. These are a third apart. Now, take a look at this larger interval. Might want to zoom out just a little. Now, see, these are definitely not a third apart anymore, are they? They're much
That is
further
an
than a
octave
third
apart.
But notice this
Wait,
note up
is
here
it?
is still
No.
E. Just
That's
like the E that I played
C and
down
E.
here.
There's more
This
than an
interval
octave
is
apart.
actually called a tenth.
A
It
tenth.
actually, if you'll notice, it involves 10 white keys on the piano. So this is a compound interval. Here's the octave right here. So this interval is larger than an octave. But in the end, harmonically speaking, you're going to find that it's essentially still thought of as a third. Harmonically, it pretty much works the same way. It's just thought of as a third that's been expanded by an octave. And then, of course, I could go even further up here and play the third up in the next octave. I don't know what number this is. What would that be? That would be a 17th, I believe.
17th.
But again, it's really, this is just the same notes, C and E. It's just thought of as a third that's been expanded by 1, 2 octaves, and then we have our third on top of that. Now, it is really beyond the scope of this program to really look much at compound intervals. Over the course of your career, you'll be soaking up more and more of that stuff anyway. But for now, it's going to take all we can do really just to get us in touch with the simple intervals.
Okay.
Now, and that's what we're going to be listing in this chart over here.
Never mind. I don't have to write that down.
How many simple intervals are there? Well, it depends on how you look at it. We're going to be talking about some very interesting subjects today, too. One way of looking at it is there are 13 different simple intervals.
13.
But in another way, what you're going to find out is actually there are an infinite number of simple intervals. And we'll get to that distinction in a moment.
Infinite number.
But
Really?
now we're going to start to fill in. If you notice up here, this is our chart here. Remember, we said we had to name it, define it, give examples, and to also give formulas, and in this particular case on the subject of intervals, what we mean by formulas is how large actually are these intervals, and we're going to measure them in half steps and whole steps, and we'll be talking about that in a moment. And then in this column over here, we'll be looking at the fingerings for them on the neck of your guitar. And interestingly enough, this is very simple. If you know your musical number system and you understand your major scale, you'll notice that these intervals get their names from how they relate to the musical number system, which is based on the major scale. So to figure out how to finger these intervals, all you really have to do is look at your major scale fingerings. Now you might want to go back to that lesson. I have charts that I'll show you when we get there, but you might want to go back to that lesson and make sure that you also are looking at your major scale fingerings, because they will become important when we start looking at the fingerings for these different intervals over here. Okay, there are, conventionally speaking, 13 different simple intervals and that we're going to look at, and we're going to start with the smallest one. And the smallest one, a lot of people go, is it a half step? You might remember us talking about that when we were talking about the musical number system and the major scale, and knowing that a scale is a particular sequence of intervals. What types of intervals? Half steps and whole steps. Remember what those were? When you go from one note to the note right next to it, that's a half step. When you skip a note, that's a whole step. And those, of course, are small, simple intervals that we're going to be talking about. But interestingly enough, there is one interval, one conventional interval, that's actually smaller than a half step. What is it? Well, it's a distance between two notes of 0. Just like in math, 0 is considered a number. A distance between two pitches that have no distance between them at all is actually considered an interval, but its distance, and we'll write this down at the bottom of the page here, is 0. For example, if I pick up my guitar here, you don't need a close-up of this, but if I play this note on my guitar, and then I play this note on the piano, they're the same pitch, aren't they? They are the same note. There is no distance between those two notes, but that is still considered an interval, and you've heard of the name of this interval in other contexts. This is what's called a unison. You might have heard people saying stuff like, oh, see those people over there, they're singing in unison, as opposed to, see those people over there, they're singing in harmony. People that are singing in harmony are singing notes, different notes. The different people are singing different notes that sound good together. That's what harmony is. People who are singing in unison are all singing the same note. This is also a very special interval. It's singled out, and we'll learn the meaning of this word in a little while. It's actually known as a perfect unison. That is the smallest simple interval that you're going to want to know about, and it has a distance of 0. If you measure it either in half steps or in whole steps, of course, its size is 0. Now, just for a moment, let's skip up to the top part of the chart here, because let's take a look at what is the largest simple interval. And what it actually is an octave. Remember, we said that all simple intervals are either an octave or smaller, so the largest simple interval is the octave. And interestingly enough, this is another one of those intervals that's separated out, singled out as what's known as a perfect interval. It's what's known as a perfect octave. Now, what is the next interval larger than, oops, I'm sorry, let's go back up to the octave here again. Remember, we also need to know how large these intervals are. That's the formula for these intervals. We know that it's called a perfect octave. How large is an octave? Well, you know that there are 13 notes per octave in a chromatic scale, and they are all separated by half steps, which means that there are 12 half steps in an octave. So if we measure an octave in terms of half steps, it's actually 12 half steps, which means it's also 6 whole steps. Because remember, a whole step is 2 half steps. Okay, now, the smallest interval was this one down here called a perfect unison. What is the next simple interval larger than a unison? Well, conventionally speaking, we're going to put this up here, in the 2 up from here. Conventionally speaking, the next interval larger than a perfect unison is this interval that we've up till now been calling a half step. What you're going to find out in a moment is that this interval, as many of the intervals, have more than one name. But we'll get back to that in a minute. First of all, we're going to talk about a rather interesting little subject here for a moment. Remember I said before, there's two ways of looking at simple intervals. There's either 13 of them or there's an infinite number of simple intervals. Well, remember back when we were talking about the caveman thing, we learned that there are actually an infinite number of musical pitches, all infinitely close together. What that means is that there are an infinite number of musical pitch distances between notes. This interval up here that we call a half step could be divided, if you wanted to, up into a million smaller intervals, or a billion, or two, or three, and collectively all of these intervals these infinite intervals that don't quite fit within our 12-note pitch system are all collectively known as microtones. And there are an infinite number of microtones if you understand that there are an infinite number of musical pitches. Now, the most notorious microtone is an interval of a quarter step. But remember, there's an infinite number of microtones, but the one you're going to hear about the most is a quarter step, which of course would be the pitch that would be halfway in between the notes in a
Let the guitar commence.
Half step. And remember, a half step is the very next note on the piano. So how do you play quarter steps on a piano? Well, the answer is you can't. The smallest interval that you can play on a piano is a half step. So how do you play quarter steps? Well, you can't play them on a piano at all.
You can
So
play my
how
guitar.
significant are quarter steps to Western popular music? Well, I think that's up for debate a little bit. First of all, none of the piano music you've ever heard has quarter steps in it. How do you play quarter steps on a guitar if your frets divide the neck all up into half steps? Well, the answer is, conventionally speaking, you can't play a quarter step on the guitar either. However, you can play quarter steps by bending the note a little. I'm sure you all know a little bit about bent notes on a guitar. You can take a note and bend its pitch like that by stretching the string. Now, so that's the only way to play quarter steps on a guitar, too. So how significant are quarter steps in Western music? My thought is not very much. You are going to hear people talking about quarter steps in ethnic music around the planet. Every now and then you're going to hear somebody mention that there are quarter steps in blues music. I think that that's probably true. There certainly are little bent notes in blues guitar that don't really qualify as half steps. But sometimes I think that's overstated. Sometimes I think people believe that there are a lot of quarter steps in the blues because they see blues guitar players bending notes a lot. I think some people have it in their heads that any time that you bend a note on the guitar, that's actually a quarter step, but that's not true at all. Overwhelmingly, when you bend a note on the guitar, you are either bending it a half step or a whole step.
Yeah.
Conventionally speaking, bent notes on the guitar are just a different way of approaching a note. If I play this note here, I could play the note that's a half step above that simply by going to the next fret and playing that note. But another way I could do it would be to take this string and bend it. Doesn't that sound pretty much the same as... That's a half step bend. I could also do a whole step bend. Here's what a whole step bend sounds like. See, I'm skipping a fret. When I finger it, that's what a whole step sounds like. I can also bend this note a whole step. Whoops. So I think that the only reason that people think that there's a lot of quarter steps in blues music is they're thinking that every time you bend a note that's a quarter step, but that's not true. But I will grant that there are probably quarter steps in blues playing. Well, at least things that they're certainly microtones. Whether or not they're exactly a quarter step, I can't really say. My ears aren't actually even trained. Most Western players don't know what quarter steps actually sound like. Some of you who played horns know that there are some intonation issues when you play a brass instrument, particularly that might involve microtones, but I don't think they really qualify as quarter steps. Another interesting step or subject that you might actually want to know about is actually there is an entire school of music called microtonal music, where people experiment with composing music that uses intervals other than these conventional intervals that we know about. They are called microtonalists. You've got to figure that once the 12-note system was established, it was only a matter of time before somebody stood up and said, hey, look, how come we think that all this music has to be composed with a pitch system where we divide the octave equally up into 12 units? I'm going to experiment with mathematically dividing the octave up into
24.
17 units.
17.
I mean, that would be, since we know there's an infinite number of ways to divide up an octave, that would be possible. We could take our conventional intervals and shrink them all a little bit. We could have something that's like a half step, but it's actually only 1/17 of an octave instead of 1/12 of an octave. And You have probably never heard any microtonal music in your life. You don't hear it on the radio on any given day. If you listen to National Public Radio or music education programming, you might have bumped into this concept once or twice before, but they actually take themselves very seriously, microtonalists. If you ever get an opportunity to listen to some microtonal music, it's rather interesting to listen to, but you get a funny experience. I've been known to say I've listened to some microtonal music, and it's interesting that if you really concentrate on listening to microtonal music, you'll have an interesting kind of audio experience. The funny thing is, if you let your mind wander at all while you're listening to microtonal music, a little voice in the back of your head starts going, gee, I wish somebody would tune those instruments.
Yes,
We are
dude.
so used to listening to
Gee, I
12-note
wish
varieties
somebody would
of
tune those
music
instruments.
that anything else registers in our minds, kind of like just music that's out of tune, interestingly enough. Some of the people that get involved in microtonal music, they actually have to kind of train themselves to forget what conventional music sounds like altogether. Anyway, that's just in case you bump into some microtonal music one of these days. You can even do a little research on it, and you might find it a very interesting subject. But remember, we're here to talk about conventional popular music. And so let's take a look more at some of our more conventional simple intervals. We know that the smallest one is a perfect unison. Now, the next conventional simple interval above that is a half step. And we're also about to find out that this interval has a couple of different names as well. First of all, sometimes you may hear a half step referred to as a semitone. Now there's that word tone again, which remember I'm suggesting that maybe we're better off associating with the concept of timbre. Here we're talking about pitch, so I don't tend to use the word semitone very much. I will use the word half step, but also you're about to also find out that there is another very significant, perhaps more official term for a half step, which relates it to the musical number system. And if we can look over here, you'll see, you remember our good old friend, the musical number system. The really official names of these intervals relate them to how they relate to the musical number system. And a half step, if we can zoom in on the musical number system over here for a moment, a half step, of course, in the musical number system would be the distance between note number 1 and, for this purposes now, let's call it flat 2. So a half step would be from note number 1 to flat 2. So this interval, the more official name for this interval is it's referred to as a minor second. And we'll be, in a moment, we'll be talking about the meanings of the word major and minor too, but you just trust me for now. A half step, its really more official name is it's known as a minor second. Now, of course, the next interval larger than a half step is our good old friend, the whole step. By the way, a half step, if we measure it, of course, remember, that's what the formula for these intervals are. We know that a perfect unison is a distance of 0. A half step, of course, is either one half step or it's a half of a whole step. Now, this next larger interval up here we call a whole step. It also has a couple of other names. Sometimes a whole step is referred to as a tone. Now, again, I don't tend to use that term too much. But also, if we look over at our musical number system over here, you'll see that a whole step is actually the distance between note number 1 and note number 2. Note number 2 being a note that's actually in a major scale, this interval is referred to as a major second. See, these are the interval names that relate them to how the musical number system actually works. So, now if we measure a whole step, we know that it is, of course, one whole step, but it is also 2 half steps. Remember, a whole step is 2 half steps. You skip a note. Let's take a look at how we play, though, these intervals on the guitar. I think we've already covered this plenty of times, but just remember, whenever you go from one note to the next on the neck of your guitar, the very next fret, that's an interval of a half step, no matter where you are. no matter what alphabet letters these represent. This is always that interval that we call a half step when we go from one note to the next. Now, the next interval larger than that, of course, is a whole step, and that's when you play a note, and then you skip a fret and go to the next note above that, no matter where you are. That's a whole step. Whereas a half step is when you play a note and then you skip and then you go to the half step is when you go to the fret right next to it, whereas a whole step is when you skip a fret. There are fingerings, of course, for all these other intervals too, and we'll be covering those. So, our simple intervals that we want to know about so far are a perfect unison, a half step, better known as a minor second, and a whole step, better known as a major second. Now, what is the next simple interval larger than that? There is a interval that, of course, is 3 half steps, or 1.5 whole steps. This would take us from note number 1 up to sharp 2 or flat 3 in the musical number system right here. That would be 3 half steps, 1, 2, 3. This interval has a couple of different names too. Because it is the distance from note number 1 to flat 3, it is sometimes referred to as a minor third. But when it's thought of as being the distance from note number 1 to sharp 2, it is known as an augmented second. So an augmented second. This interval has 2 different names, and this has to do with the function of the different intervals. A minor third or an augmented second are the same interval. They are 3 half steps or 1.5 whole steps. Now, of course, the next interval larger than that would be 4 half steps or 2 whole steps. And that would be the distance from note number 1 to note number 3 in our musical number system. So this interval is referred to as a major third. Now, there are a certain number of times when this might be also referred to as a diminished fourth. You can kind of see how this is going. All has to do with the musical number system. The interval that is 4 half steps or 2 whole steps is the distance from note number 1 to note number 3, sometimes mostly referred to as a major third, sometimes referred to as a diminished fourth. Now, the next interval larger than that, of course, would be 5 half steps, or 2.5 whole steps. This would be the distance from note number 1 in our musical number system all the way up to note number 4. Notice, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's 5 half steps from note number 1 to note number 4. That is what is known. This is another one of these intervals that's singled out as a perfect interval. This is what's known as a perfect fourth. Remember, all of these intervals get their names from how they relate to the musical number system. So, just to quickly check in on that, why is this interval called a perfect fourth? Is it because it's 4 half steps? No. Is it because it's 4 whole steps? No. As we know, it's actually 5 half steps or 2.5 whole steps. Well then, why do we call it a perfect fourth? Well, that's because it is the distance between note number 1 and note number 4 in the musical number system, in a major scale, depending on how you want to think of it. That is actually 5 half steps. So even though it's 5 half steps, it's called a perfect fourth because it's the distance between note number 1 and note number 4. Now, let's skip this next interval for a moment, which of course would be 6 half steps or 3 whole steps. And let's go up to the next one above that just for a moment. That is 7 half steps, or 3.5 whole steps. This is another hugely important interval in music. It would be the distance between note number 1 and note number 5 in our musical number system. That would be 7 half steps. But however, being the distance between note number 1 and note number 5, this is another one of those special intervals that's singled out as a perfect interval. This is what's known as a perfect fifth. Like I said, in this other column over here, in a few minutes, we're going to be actually defining what the words major, minor, perfect, augmented, and diminished. These are all different types of intervals, very easy to understand, and we'll be looking at them in a moment. Now, we skipped this interval here that was 6 half steps because there's just some interesting things about this. The first thing to realize is this interval is the actual mathematical middle of the octave. Notice how it is 6 half steps or 3 whole steps. This is actually the middle of the octave. Remember the 3 most important notes in music when we talked about the caveman stuff? It was 1, 5, 8. Some people get it in their heads then that 5, note number 5, is actually in the middle of the octave, and it turns out it actually isn't. If you look at it, the 5th is actually 1 half step high of the middle of the octave. If you know that an octave is 12 half steps or 6 whole steps, then the perfect fifth, which is 7 half steps, couldn't possibly be the middle of the octave. It's actually 1 half step high of the middle of the octave. In a way, that's what makes our whole pitch system work. It is that very fact that the fifth is a half step above the middle of the octave that kind of alerted us to what a half step was in the first place, if you think about it. Now, this interval, which is the actual mathematical middle of the octave, has a couple of different names. Sometimes it's more convenient to think of it as the very next interval larger than a perfect fourth, so it is often referred to as an augmented fourth.
An augmented fourth.
But in an equal number of contexts, it's more significant to think of it as the next interval smaller than a perfect fifth. So it's actually also known as a diminished fifth.
Also a diminished fifth.
These distinctions become important really later on when you're learning about the function of these different intervals within particular pieces of music.
Yep.
But for now, it's just important to know that these intervals have multiple names, and it would be a good idea to memorize them. Interestingly enough, another name
It would be a very good idea.
right here, since it is 3 whole steps, and since a whole step is also sometimes referred to as a tone, this interval that is 3 whole steps is often known as a tritone, being 3 whole steps. That's actually what a tritone is. Now, a couple of things
3
just,
whole steps.
that we'll mention now about these intervals that we call perfect intervals. We've seen all of them now. There are 4 of them. There's a perfect unison, a perfect fourth, a perfect fifth, and a perfect octave. Now, what does the word perfect mean? Well,
I don't
interestingly
know.
enough, I'm not actually 100% sure that I know every last thing about this.
He
But
doesn't either.
One thing you can certainly say about these 4 intervals is they certainly are some of the most central intervals in music. And one thing that we know about, or we could say about that, is remember, we said when we were talking about the caveman thing that 1, 5, 8 are the 3 most important notes in all of music. So wouldn't the intervals that separate those notes be the most important intervals in music? And you might recall that the distance between note number 1 and note number 8 is an octave. So that's why that's referred to as a perfect octave. The distance from note number 1 to note number 5, as we know now, is called a fifth. So that's why that's referred to as a perfect fifth. And of course, you might also recall that the distance between note number 5 and note number 8 is a perfect fourth. It's a fourth. Why is the distance, to remind ourselves, why is the distance between note number 5 and note number 8 referred to as a perfect fourth? Well, that's because the distance from note number 5 to note number 8 is the same as the distance from note number 1 to note number 4. We look down here, we can see that. Here's note number 5. How far is it to note number 8? It is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 half steps. How far is it from note number 1 to note number 4? It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 half steps. So that's why the distance from note number 5 to note number 8 is called a fourth. And it being another one of those all-time most important intervals, that's why it's referred to as a perfect fourth. The unison, I suppose you could say, which is the fourth perfect interval, would be then the distance from, say, note number 1 to note number 1. You know what I mean? So all of the perfect intervals can be extrapolated right from 1, 5, 8. So that's another place where those three notes become so important because they kind of gave us these most important of intervals.
1, 5, 8.
Okay, we ended off here with the perfect fifth, which was 7 half steps or 3.5 whole steps. What's the next interval larger than that? Well, it would be 8 half steps or 4 whole steps. This interval has a couple of different names too. Sometimes it's best thought of as the next interval larger than a perfect fifth, so it is often referred to as an augmented fifth. Which, and of course, that would be the distance from note number 1 to sharp 5, flat 6. So that's why we can see that that would be called an augmented fifth, the sharp 5 right there. But in an equal number of contexts, we might think of that note more as being flat 6. So the distance from 1 to flat 6 is known as a minor 6. So an augmented fifth and a minor sixth are that same interval, which is 8 half steps or 4 whole steps. Now, the next interval larger than that, of course, would be 9 half steps or 4.5 whole steps. That would take us all the way up here to note number 6, from note number 1 to note number 6. This interval is usually known as a major sixth. But sometimes this will also be known as a diminished seventh. You can always see that these intervals have two different names, kind of like the number that you actually are on, and then the next one larger or smaller than that. Major sixth, diminished seventh is the interval that is 9 half steps or 4.5 whole steps. We've only got a couple more to go here, don't we, until we get up to the octave. Remember, like I said, you got to learn this stuff, but it's really not all that big a deal, is it? There's only 13 of them. If you just put a little work into it, you'd have them all nailed in within a week or two, you know what I mean? The next interval larger than a major sixth, of course, would be 10 half steps or 5 whole steps. This interval is sometimes known as an augmented sixth. Again, because it's just a little bit larger than a major sixth. More commonly, though, you'll find this interval being referred to as, of course, augmented sixth, because now we're going to note number sharp 6 up here. But also, we know that same note as flat 7, so the distance from note number 1 to flat 7 is referred to as a minor 7. Only got one more to go. This is the interval that is 11 half steps or 5.5 whole steps. This interval is sometimes known as a diminished octave or a diminished eighth, but more commonly known as a major seventh. And there you go. Those are your 13 different simple intervals, obviously. No big challenge on this. Now, we showed you how to finger half steps and whole steps on the guitar. You could probably see that if you just continue to expand the distance between the notes that you played, then you could play all these larger intervals too. We're also, in a few minutes, or actually maybe the next hour, we really get into this seriously.
The next hour, yeah. This is only the first hour of intervals.
On the guitar too. It's really very simple to do, particularly as I mentioned before, if you remember that they all relate to the musical number system, which relates to the major scale. So all you're really going to have to do is look at your major scale fingering. We'll probably just start to look at that today, and we'll go mostly into the fingering next time. But before we do that, we should probably sort out what these different words mean: major, minor, augmented, diminished, perfect. Because these are different categories of intervals. These are different distinctions.
I want to write them down. I'll do it later. I really will do it later. I'm not going to fucking do it on stream. It's going to be annoying to rewind. You guys aren't even, you don't care, but I care.
Simple intervals and compound intervals. And remember, simple intervals are the intervals that are 1 octave and smaller. All of the intervals that will fit inside 1 octave, and those are the only ones that we've actually looked at so far. Simple intervals. Compound intervals are larger than 1 octave and generally thought of as simple intervals that are expanded by 1 octave. Another distinction that we should make right now, although we haven't mentioned this before, is the distinction between melodic intervals and harmonic intervals. And this is a good time. If we haven't talked about these two terms enough to really get them to stick in your mind, this would be not a bad time for us to talk about melody and harmony, because obviously this is going to have to do with why we call these intervals what they are. What is melody? What is harmony? Well, melody, and we're going to be talking about this later, so I'm not going to go heavily into this right now, but melody, what is the melody of a song? The melody, for example, in a pop tune or a rock tune, is generally that part that you remember, it sticks in your head. It's usually the part that the singers sing. It involves a sequence of individual notes. Here, for example, is the melody to Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. You're all familiar with that melody there. That was a sequence of individual notes. Now, humans, when they sing, an individual human can't sing more than 1 note at a time, can't they? So when a singer is singing, he is singing a sequence of individual notes. Remember, if we haven't mentioned this before, too, here's a question for you. Do singers sing different notes than guitar players play? And the answer is no. For all intents and purposes, the human voice is simply another musical instrument in the Western world that is generally working off that 12-note pitch system that we all know about. So I can play those exact same notes.
I'm trying to think of the melody now. I don't know. I don't feel like figuring it out.
I can play the melody of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. I can play that on piano. I, of course, could sing that melody. I can play it on a saxophone. I can play it on a guitar. So, that's what melody is. Melody is a sequence of individual notes. What is harmony? We're talking here about...
Harmony is when 2 notes work together and it sounds good.
Melody is a sequence of individual notes. Harmony is the concept that you're going to be playing multiple notes at the same time. So
Chord.
melody is more closely related to scale. It has more to do with individual notes in the sequence, where harmony has more to do with like chords. It's where you're playing more than one note simultaneously. At least two notes simultaneously. So that's the distinction between melody and harmony. Melody is strings of individual notes. Harmony is multiple notes played at the same time, stacked on top of each other. So what does this tell us about these two different types of intervals? Melodic intervals and harmonic intervals. Well, any one of these simple intervals, or indeed any interval, can be played as a melodic interval or as a harmonic interval. Simply put, a melodic interval is two notes played in sequence. Whereas a harmonic interval would be two notes played.
Okay. I might be insane, but I think I might be a bit out of tune. Alright, supposedly we were just a little bit sharp on our E string. Let's see. Yeah, this is just my technique. There's some buzzing in my fingers. It's not stable all the way.
Together. So, for example, let's take this interval of a major third, which is 4 half steps or 2 whole steps. I could play, of course, a major third on the guitar, on the piano, and of course we're going to be looking at, like I say, don't get nervous about the fact that you're taking guitar lessons and I'm showing you all the stuff on the piano. When we get into the next hour, we're going to show you all the fingerings of this on guitar. Remember, it's just the notion that, the guitar is really a much more confusing instrument than the keyboards are. The keyboards are nice and linear, you get all your musical concepts down by looking at how they relate to the keyboard instruments, and then it requires a little bit of extra knowledge to understand how to translate this stuff over to the guitar neck because of the overlapping nature of the strings. Remember, we talked all about that. We talked about how the guitar strings are 4 notes apart because you have 4 fingers. It just makes the fingerings a little more confusing to understand. So we often look at these things over here. So a major third would be the distance between note number 1 and note number 3. So, for example, that would involve these 2 white keys on the piano. And you'll notice they're 4 half steps apart. 1, 2, 3, 4, or 2 whole steps. A major third. Now, I could play this major third interval as either a melodic major third or as a harmonic major third. The only distinction would be, do I play these notes as 2 notes in a sequence, like that, where you're not hearing both of the notes at the same time? Or am I playing these 2 notes simultaneously? That would be a harmonic major third. So a melodic major third is when I go from one note to the note to the major third in sequence. Whereas a harmonic major third would be when I play the two notes together. I mean, I can do the same thing with any interval. Here's a melodic perfect fifth. See, I played the two notes in a sequence. Wasn't playing them at the same time. Here's a harmonic perfect fifth. I'm playing the two notes at the same time. So, we've looked at the distinction between simple and compound intervals. We've looked at the difference between melodic and harmonic intervals. Now, how about some of these other terms that we ran into over here? Major intervals versus minor intervals versus augmented and diminished and perfect intervals. Well, first, let's take a look at what a major interval is. We know we have major thirds and major sixths and major sevenths. What distinguishes a major interval, say, from a minor interval, first of all? Well, it's this. If I start on note number 1 and I go up 4 half steps, 1, 2, 3, 4, I wind up on note number 3, don't I? Now, if you remember your stuff about your major scale and the musical number system, you will remember that note number 3 is in a major diatonic scale, isn't it? So, what a major interval is when you start at note number 1 and go up a major interval, you land on a note that's actually in a major scale, which of course note number 3 is. So, the definition of a major interval is like this. Go up a major interval from note number 1, and you land on a note that is in a major scale. So, if your interval in question takes
Your
you to a
interval in
note
question.
that's in a major scale, that distance would be called a major interval. So, if we start on note number 1, and we're contemplating the interval that goes up to note number 6, note number 6 is in a major scale, so that's 9 half steps, as you might recall, or that you're soon going to want to memorize. It's 9 half steps from note number 1 to note number 6. That drops you off on note number 6. Note number 6 is in a major scale, so the distance between note number 1 and note number 6 is a major sixth. Now let's contrast that with the distance from note number 1 to flat 6. Flat 6, as you might recall, is not a note that's in a major scale, is it? Remember, the notes that are in the major scale are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Flat 6 is in between the notes in a major scale. Flat 6 is not in a major scale. So the distance from note number 1 to flat 6 is not a major interval. It's actually a minor interval. That's what minor intervals are. If you go up a minor interval, go up a minor interval from note number 1, and you land on a note that's not in a major scale. Land on a note that is not in a major scale. So the notes that you would land on that would get you major intervals would be 2, 3, 6, and 7. So the distance from note number 1 to note number 3 is a major third, but the distance from note number 1 to flat 3 is a minor third. Now you might go, why didn't you mention notes number 4 and 5? They're in a major scale. Aren't there major fourths and major fifths? Well, remember, those are those intervals that are separated out, that are singled out as the perfect interval. So there really isn't a major fourth or a major fifth, even though they are notes that are in a major scale. Remember, those are the intervals that are considered perfect intervals. So they're a little bit different. What, by the way, does the word perfect mean? As I mentioned before, I've wondered for a while whether I know every last little thing about this. When we talked before and we talk in the future about things like a cycle of fifths and a cycle of fourths, I think you'll find that there are other concepts involved with this. But certainly, one thing that we can say about perfect intervals is these are the intervals that come directly from. They come from important notes in all of music. 1, 5, 8. The distance between note number 1 and note number 5 is a fifth, so therefore it's a perfect fifth. The distance from note number 5 to note number 8, as we mentioned before, is a fourth, so it's called a perfect fourth. The distance from note number 1 to note number 8 is an octave, so it's called a perfect octave. And the distance from note number 1 to note number 1 is a unison, perfect unison. Okay, so that's about all the time we have for today. We still have a lot more to talk about intervals. We need to fill in some of these other distinctions over here between different sorts of intervals. We need to talk about what are called inverted intervals. And of course, most importantly for you as the guitar player, you need to go back and look at how to feel all of these intervals on the neck of your guitar. You're going to find out absolutely that's what we're doing. Oops, sorry, we're going to fill in this column over here, all the different fingers for these intervals. They're very easy to understand, particularly if you remember that all this stuff and all this interval management relates to the musical metric system. We are also going to be reviewing some of the other concepts that you need to remember about intervals and things like that. So, quickly to wrap this up, remember, intervals, possibly the largest subject in music theory. Remember, ear training is the largest concept in all of music, if you ask me. Getting your ears trained is the most important thing. Oh, and by the way, I should mention that. The other thing that you need to know about all these intervals, of course, is eventually you need to get to the point where you know what they all sound like. And I'll be demonstrating to you next week that I know what all these intervals sound like. And I can play any note on the piano. You could request any one of these intervals, and within a half a second, I can be singing. Remember, each person is all about singing. I can be singing the interval to request it above the note on the piano. So, that's enough for today. I'm your host, Scotty Beck. Make sure to look at that over all your review material and everything like that. As you're seeing, all of this stuff is interconnected. And we'll be back to finish up the subject of intervals next time. So, we'll see you then, okay? Enjoy.